In today's episode of Truth Uncoiled, we're breaking down the Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell case. Now, I'm excited because I want to talk more about the legal of this case and how it eventually got to where Lori Vallow was convicted guilty and is now serving life in prison, and Chad Daybell was convicted and found guilty and is now on death row as he was sentenced to death. It's going to be a really great episode. Stick around. It all stems from the background of these people. Now, Lori Vallow Daybell, she's been called the doomsday mom, right? Stemming from the disappearance and deaths of her children. She's been called every name in the book, right? A monster and a cult mom. And some of the evidence that came out in her trial and then eventually in Chad Daybell's trial just laid out this just crazy process of what led to her eventually being okay with her children being murdered. And it just blows my mind as a mom, as a lawyer. You wonder how people can get so sick in the head that they justify this kind of behavior. And from the evidence that came out with Lori Daybell, I mean, it was absolutely just like a sickness, like something that is, I would say, unexplainable. But yeah, here we are trying to explain it. And when we're talking about like the deaths connected to these people, like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, there are specifically 6 deaths that are directly connected to them. And let's just go through them real fast. Like we know JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan, who were Lori Vallow's kids. They were murdered and tragically buried on Chad Daybell's property. The findings and how the children were found was just absolutely horrific. The evidence that came out and just it was just sickening. And then we know that Charles Vallow, who was Lori Vallow's ex-husband and the father of JJ and Tylee, after their disappearance, he was shot and killed by Alex Cox, who is Lori Vallow's brother. And then Alex Cox mysteriously died. And then Chad Daybell's wife, current wife, Tammy Daybell, mysteriously passed away. A few weeks after her death, he then married Lori Daybell. So I mean, just this web of just murder and lies and deceit. And I mean, just a story that we'll hear forever with the conspiracies and the speculation and why'd she do it. And I honestly think that we don't need to give her that much credit. Like she's an evil person who justified horrific acts because of whatever she was being, whether it was religious fanatic or just she was able to convince herself what she was doing was for a greater good. And she's just a horrible person. Her and Chad Daybell together. Like I think if we were to keep them separately, I honestly believe it was for 2 different reasons. Chad Daybell, from the evidence that came out, I mean, I think of him as a cult leader. He wanted power. He could manipulate weaker people by this, doomsday rhetoric that he believed. And he would find very fragile people within the religion that he grew up with to manipulate, to gaslight, and to convince them that they needed to prepare for the end of times. I mean, how many times have we heard this in different facets of different sects, different groups, different religious people claiming that they did it all in the guise of, the end of times is coming, the wrath is coming, and therefore they justify their behavior. But at the end of the day, it's control, right? It's being able to be the person in power to convince and to, whether Chad Daybell believed it, I don't know. But he was trying to convince other people to follow him. And Lori Daybell was one of those people that he was able to manipulate, control, and eventually get to believe in this. And together, they started an affair. Chad Daybell was married to Tammy Daybell, and they started some kind of affair. And then all of a sudden, Tammy Daybell gets sick and passes away in her sleep. And, everything surrounding that was so suspicious because Chad Daybell didn't want a autopsy. He buried her super, super quickly. I mean, there was a lot of things behind that. You're like, why? Like, what do you have to hide, right? Maybe that death will go, I don't know, unsolved. Chad's already been found guilty of her murder. He's been found guilty of conspiracy of murder, of JJ and Tylee. I mean, he got the death penalty. Whether we know exactly the elements behind it, he's never going to tell us, right? But the jurors believe that there was enough evidence to convict him. And then we look at the facts leading up to like Lori Daybell and um, her brother shooting Charles Vallow. And not only that, they were able to convince the police down in Arizona that it was self-defense, that Charles was going after him and he shot him dead for self-defense. But then all of a sudden Alex Cox just, dies. And he had something to do with the murders of JJ and Tylee because we have evidence of that. And all of a sudden he just, he dies. So I don't know what better way to say it than just gross, right? And a lot of the evidence in Lori Daybell was that she planned this, that she believed that her kids were possessed, that they some in this doomsday cult believed in like a ranking of the children's spirits, and if they were at a certain level they were then unsavable, and that's where JJ had gotten. And then unfortunately um JJ and Tylee were murdered. I mean, and I would say brutally in the sense. In the meanwhile, Lori is stealing their money, taking their Social Security disability that they were getting from their dad's death. And then she runs off to Hawaii to marry Chad Daybell a couple weeks after his wife died, when Lori was on trial. So it was interesting because Lori in Idaho did not waive her right to a speedy trial. And because of that, the prosecution had to be prepared to present their case in a timely manner. Lori was in jail. She had no bail. And the prosecution kept saying, we need more time because this is a death penalty case. And the defense counsel said, no, we're going to trial. And we asked that the court just take the death penalty off the table. And that's what the judge ended up doing after the arguments from both sides. The judge decided that he took off the death penalty. So if Lori was convicted, she could only be sentenced to life in prison. And that's exactly what happened. The jurors convicted her, and then she was sentenced to life in prison. Now, she is extradited down to Arizona right now because they are going to try her for the murders of Charles Vallow. And so that will be interesting how that goes. But even if she's convicted, she'll get life in prison down in Arizona, and then it will be a determination of Arizona keep her in prison or Idaho. Because Idaho is the first to convict, she'll probably go back to Idaho prison. Chad Daybell, when he was going and he was being charged with murder, he waived his right to a speedy trial. So they did not have to hurry his trial. And therefore, he was not tried almost a year after Lori's trial. Because of that, the prosecutors did not take the death penalty off the table. And the defense counsel filed a motion to take it off because they believe that if it was off the table for Lori, it should be off the table for Chad. And the judge heard the arguments and denied that and said, no, it's up to the jury to decide if he's going to be convicted to life in prison or death penalty. And so when he was convicted just this last spring, a few weeks later, he was then given the death penalty in his case. And that's probably going to go up on appeal because there's a lot of questions surrounding why. Is it truly because Lori did not waive her right to a speedy trial? Is that the reason why she didn't get the death penalty, but Chad Daybell did? Is it because she's a woman and he's a man? Like, there's going to be a lot of questions around that, and it's probably going to go all the way up to the Idaho Supreme Court to determine constitutionality, the statute. Like, was that a clear error on part of the judge? And they will be fighting that. One of the things that's interesting is now that Chad Daybell has been found guilty, a lot of people are like, well, when will he get the death penalty? And years. And honestly, he could never be put to death. There'll be so many appeals, there'll be so many fights. He'll be in prison and he'll be on death row while he's fighting all this. But anything could happen. Idaho could decide to take away their death penalty in 10 years, and then they can't get it. So it's just, there's a lot of depending factors that could possibly bring that up. But at the end of the day, it doesn't, I mean, he's not going to get out of prison, right? I don't see any reason why the Supreme Court of Idaho would overturn the conviction. It was a very clean trial. It was, I think, presented very, very well. The evidence was, I didn't see that there would be any question of impropriety that would make it so that the defense or the prosecutors were doing anything that would warrant the Supreme Court overturning or the Court of Appeals overturning. So I think at the end of the day, convictions are going to be upheld. And it's now going to just be a matter of, is Chad Daybell going to be executed? Idaho hasn't had an execution in a long time. It's just one of those things where we just don't know. Don't hold your breath, right? So this case was again just another just interesting breakdown of the psyche, the evidence that came out in Chad Daybell's case that I thought was just absolutely the craziest was when they had somebody that was part of the doomsday cult testify to like their beliefs and what what she had heard Chad Daybell say and preach. And it was just crazy. That's when we learned about the ranking system for children. And if they get to a certain amount, they believe that they're lost. And it was just really hard, really gross, really sad to hear. And I think that was a key piece of evidence on prosecution side to show the mindset of we call it the forethought. Like this was premeditated, and which is why capital murder was being charged. They planned this. It happened. It was not in a heat of passion. I mean, it was planned, and premeditated murder gets you capital offense and can get you the death penalty, life in prison, and that's what both of them got. I believe that the evidence was overwhelming in favor of that. I was grateful for the jury to be able to see it, follow it, understand it, and then eventually do what, as an attorney looking in, believes should have happened in the first place. So that is another episode of Truth Uncoiled, and I'm really excited for next week's episode.